Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today this is the 13th episode of my ReactJS course, and this is the last episode before we start building the final project for the course. And in this episode, what we're going to be learning is something that was requested since the beginning by a lot of you guys, which is a tutorial on how to manage your states using Redux. More specifically, we're going to be using Redux Toolkit, which is basically an easier way to use Redux. It's used everywhere nowadays. And I'm just going to give you guys a simple example and go over exactly how to use the library. Before we get into the video, if you could leave a like and subscribe, I would massively appreciate it. I'm really happy with how the course has been going, and I'm really happy with the support. So if you could do that, I would be very grateful. So with that in mind, let's get into the tutorial. Okay everyone, so to start out this tutorial, I have this very simple example over here. It's just a simple application with routes. We have 3 pages: the home page, the login page, which just has a button and an input, and the contact page, which just has this. Basically, all I want to do is I want to have some sort of state that will be distributed between all of the different routes, meaning all the different components inside of our application. This state will be like a username. It's just a simple example, right? It's a username that the user types over here. And when they click submit login, then it will update as well and be displayed on the other components without passing down props or anything, just using Redux Toolkit. It's a very simple example, but I believe it's enough to teach Redux Toolkit because it is way easier than normal Redux, and it's very simple to understand as well. So in order to start, we need to install a couple packages in our application. So I'm going to open this up over here, and I want to show you guys that the 2 packages that we need to install are at ReactJS/Toolkit and the React Redux library. So this one, the first one, obviously is the Redux Toolkit library, and React Redux is necessary because Redux Toolkit uses it. So just press enter and it will start installing. I already have it installed inside of my application, but I'm going to clear this over here and we can start creating our application. So the first thing we need is what is known as a store. So what exactly is a store? If you've worked with the context API in the past, which if you're watching the course, I do have a video in this course early on where we do this, you know that what we usually do is we create a context, then we create a provider with that context and wrap it around all of the components that we want to have access to the states inside of that context. And then we pass an object inside of the provider called value. And inside of that object, we then pass all of the different states and functions that we want to have access to in all of the components, right? It's very simple, and Redux Toolkit is very similar as well. So, but the difference is, instead of having a value, we have what is known as a store. And a store is just a place where you're going to group all of your different global states inside of your application. And in order to create one, we're going to create a file inside of our app called store.ts. Now, I want to preface by saying that you might see all of our files are all in TypeScript. However, this tutorial will be fully in JavaScript, and at the end, I'll make all of the modifications to make it work with TypeScript as well, so that it is compatible for those using JavaScript and those using TypeScript. So now that we have our store.ts over here, we need to start configuring our store. So in order to configure our store, we need to import something from the Redux Toolkit library. We just say at Redux Toolkit, and we need to import the configure store function. So by the name, you might expect that it will create a store. So we're going to say const store is equal to configure store. And we also want to have access to this variable outside of this file. So we're going to say export const store. Now, there's a lot of configuration we need to pass inside of here. That's why it has some red squiggly line. I'm just going to put an object for now, and I'm not going to put anything inside of it. But what this will take is what is known as a reducer. Now, what is a reducer? A reducer is just a function that takes in 2 arguments. It takes in an action and it takes in the previous state of the application. And then based on those two things, it will return a new state. So it's basically a function that will describe how our states interact with each other. And it's going to be really important later on, but for now, we are not going to create a reducer. So we can just let this be like just an empty object just like this, and it should all be fine. So now that we have created our store, we're going to come to our app.tsx, and we're going to import over here something from React Redux. So what we're going to import is what is known as a provider. Now the name provider, like you might expect, is very similar to the context provider from the context API. It is a component that we use to wrap around all of the different components that we want to have access to the states. So the idea of global states means that different components will have access to the same states, right? So a provider will just specify which components will have access to those states. And when I say a state, don't think of use state, for example, because with Redux, we're not going to be using use state for that kind of situation. We're going to be using what Redux provides to us. So I'm going to grab this provider over here, and I'm going to specify which components we want to wrap this around. So the ones we want is the 3 routes over here, because they have the 3 components that we want to have access to the states. So I'm just going to put over here, wrap all of them around with the provider. And then when we have our provider, we just specify the store that will contain all of the states. So I'm going to say store is equal to store. But obviously we haven't imported this yet. So I'm just going to import the store variable from our store.ts file. And it should be working. It's obviously given us an error because we haven't added our reducer yet. But at least for now, it should all be fine. Now we need to create the reducers that are going to exist inside of this store. So I'm going to create them inside of this file, but if you want in a real project, you can actually create them in different files as well. Create a folder for them and create a simple file for each of them just for organization. But for here, I'm just going to create all of them inside of the same file. So a reducer, like I said, is just a function, and it will come from what is known as a slice. And a slice is almost a way for Redux Toolkit to automatically generate all the different parts of our reducers. So it makes it very easy for us to write Redux compared to using just normal Redux. So that's why Redux Toolkit is very advisable, because it becomes really simple when we're using something like a slice. Now, if all of this is confusing right now, don't worry. It will become a lot clearer when we start writing the code for it. So we can create everything by just coming over here at the top and importing from, actually, I'm just going to import directly from ReactJS Toolkit, the create slice function, just like this. Now we're going to create our slice, and what I want is, in our example over here, we want to be able to log in, right? Because we have this username thing over here, which is a button. And when we click on this, we want to be able to log in. I'm also going to add another button, which is going to be for logging out, just to increase like the complexity about a little bit of this project. Let's just think about it this way. If you write your username in this input and click on login, it will update the state to have your username. But if you click on logout, it will clear out that state and make it empty. So that's just the 2 functionalities that we're going to have in this app. So over here, we're going to create our slice by creating a variable called something slice. In our case, this is information about a user, so we can call it the user slice, just like this. And then we're going to set it equal to the create slice function. And the create slice function takes in an object that specifies how that slice looks like. So the first thing is the name of the slice. And think of this as almost like the variable or the name of a state in normal React. It's just something that will help us identify the information about this slice. So we're going to call it user for now, right? Then we're going to give an initial state. And in the initial state, what we want to put is an object. This object will have one thing, which is a value. And inside of here is where we specify how this user slice will look like. It can be a number, it can be a string, it can be whatever you want, right? In our case, it is a string. It's just like the username, right? But if we just put a username just like this, for example, Pedro as the initial state, I don't like that because we're not specifying in the, like when we call this, that this should be called the username. So what we can do is we can actually set this as an object and just call this username and set it equal to Pedro. Or actually, since it's the initial state, we'll just make the username be an empty string initially, but we're just setting it as the initial value, just like how we specify initial value for a state. Then we're going to come down here and we're going to define our reducers functions. So like I said, these are functions that are going to contain, they're going to take in as arguments a state and an action. And the state meaning the previous state of this application, and the action will be something we get to modify that state. And it's going to return the new value of the state. So what we do over here is we're going to create two functions that are going to be used to modify the value of the username, right? So the two functions that we're going to create, one will be called login. So why is it going to be called login? Because differently from a normal use state, we're not going to mutate it on the components that we call. We're gonna, for example, if I came to this component over here, the login, I'm not gonna mutate that value of the username right over here. I'm gonna create a function that will mutate that value inside of our slice, and then I'm just gonna call that function inside of our login component. So that's one of the main differences. And this login function, since it is a reducer, it will take in two things, a state and an action, and it will return an object just like this. Now, I said that this state thing over here will be equal to the previous state, meaning that initially this will be equal to this thing over here with an empty string. But after we modify it and we call this function again, whatever we modified this to will be equal to the state. And an action is just a placeholder for where we can send information from over here, for example, to modify it inside of this function. So for example, if we write on this input over here the name PedroTech and we call the login reducer, we're going to pass as an argument the value of PedroTech, and that will come and represent the action object over here. So what we're going to do is inside of here, we're just going to say that when we call the login function, we're going to set the state dot value, which is this object over here, equal to the action dot payload. Now, action will take in a payload, which will be the data that we're going to pass here, right? Just like I said. So all we're doing is we're just setting the new value of the state to be equal to whatever we pass over here, which is amazing. Now, the logout function will be a little bit more simple because we actually don't need any action, right? Because all we're doing with the logout is we're just basically emptying it out, right? We're just setting it to an empty string. So all we can do over here is just say that the state of value will be equal to the initial state, right? Which is this thing over here. Now, since we're reusing this twice, we can actually create a variable called initial state, just like this, and just use it twice just to make it simple, just like this, and then use it over here. So all we're doing is we're clearing out whatever username we created before. And it's giving us a red squiggly line because it says that property username is missing this. Oh, it's because we actually created the value over here. So what we can say is we can just set state equal to the initial state because it already has the value in the object. So what we have here is the two reducers that we're going to use in our application. And if it's still confusing for you, don't worry, because at the end, I'll give a recap of everything, since I understand it's a lot to learn, but it's easy when you start practicing. And for now, let's just continue doing this so that I can integrate it inside of our components. So what we want to do now is we have this user slice. So where are we able to access this login and this logout function? Well, down here, what we can do is we can export the two functions by creating a constant and setting it equal to the user slice dot actions. So when we say actions, we're getting over here an object, which is going to contain both of these functions. So we can basically just destructure them from that object by grabbing the login and the logout function. And what we're doing is we're just exporting them automatically, which is great. And now, finally, since we created our user slice, what we can do is we can come over here, create the reducers, like passing the reducer, and we can just pass in the user reducer and specify that that reducer is equal to the user slice dot reducer. So I know the syntax is a little bit weird, but the slice will contain a reducer, and that's what we're specifying in our store. And you see that automatically we don't have an error anymore. But does it work? Well, we still have a little bit of work to do. So first of all, we're going to come to the login page, and we want to put the functionality of grabbing whatever the user has in this input over here, just so that we can then submit it and change the username information. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to come over here, and surprisingly, we're going to use the useState hook to grab that information. So just because you're using Redux, it doesn't mean you don't have to use the useState hook. Sometimes for stuff like this, you will want to use it. I would say mainly put your global states inside of your Redux store, but minor stuff like this can be put into a useState hook. So I'm going to create this state for the new username. I'm going to call it new username and set new username. And we're going to set this equal to use state, and it will be a string. Then we're going to come to our input over here, and we're going to say on change. And whenever there's a change, we're just going to set the new username to be equal to whatever the event.target.value, just like this. Then we now have access to the new username that the user is typing on the input. So what we want to do is we want to use that to submit to our store whenever we click on the button. So how exactly would we do that? Well, we need to call this login and login function and also the logout later on. So how are we going to import this? Well, we're going to come over here and we're just going to say import from the store file. So 2 dots store. And we're going to import the 2 functions that we need for this file, login and logout. Then we need to import something from React Redux. This thing is used everywhere in Redux, not only Redux Toolkit, but it is called the use dispatch hook. We're going to import from React Redux just like this. And this hook is meant to dispatch any action or any one of these functions that we have in our store. So all you do is you come over here. It's pretty simple. You come over here, you just say const dispatch, and you set it equal to use dispatch. Now you use this function dispatch over here whenever you want to call one of these functions over here. So for example, on the submit login, I can say whenever you click on this button, you want to dispatch the login functionality, and inside of this login functionality we can specify the payload that is going to be used over here. So the payload will be an object with a username field, and the username field in this case will be equal to the new username that the user typed in our input. So what we're saying over here is we're logging the user in, so we're changing the username and setting it equal to the username that the user typed in the input. Then we can check this out to see if it's working, right? We'll come over here, we'll type a name. Oh, actually, we're not even displaying that information anywhere. So let me just show you guys how we can even display this. So I'm just gonna actually display it here and in other files as well. But if you want to grab the state of one of your slices, all you have to do is use another hook, which is called the useSelector hook. So useDispatch is for modifying states, and useSelector is for getting states. So the useSelector, it's simple as well. All you do is, for example, let's picture I want to grab the username, right? So I'll say username is equal to useSelector. Then this will have a function inside of here, and we'll basically write state, just like this. And the function just specifies which which information we want to get. So state will include all of the different reducers that you put inside of your store. So we only have one, so we're going to say state.user. So state.user. And then we need to specify what we want from this reducer. And we want the value, right? Because value includes the username object. So we're going to say user.value. Now, if we want to get the username from that, we can even say .username, and it should work as well. It's saying unknown, but this is a TypeScript error, which I can actually, for now, specify this as by saying any over here, and it will work. If you're using JavaScript, you don't have to do this. I'll also fix this later on. Like I said, I'll write all the TypeScript later on. But for now, let's just put this so it will work. And this username variable will now be representing this value over here. So we can display it by coming down here, and somewhere in this page, I'll just remove this and display the username, which will obviously be empty in the beginning because it's an empty string. But if I write PedroTech over here and click on the button, it will dispatch the login functionality, send in the payload that we specified over here, and change the state, which means the useSelector will now have a different value, which will then display this. And what's amazing about this is because we can actually just use the useSelector anywhere in our application. I'll just copy this and go to another component, such as the home page, and access the value of that state without having to pass in props, which is the whole point of state management. I'll come over here. I'll just paste the same thing, and I'll just call I'll just say username over here as well. And you'll see that if I go to the home page, it will also say, it actually doesn't. Did I save this? Oh, I know what happened. So when as of right now, if I were to set a state like this, and I would go to the home page, it is refreshing the page, which obviously means it refreshes the states, which means it isn't displaying the state. So what I need to do is I need to add some navigation to my app, which I'm going to just do it really quickly over here. I'm just going to put a link, which is going to go to the home page, and I'll just say to and pass in the home link just like this. And I'm going to create one for the other two as well. So basically just like this, add one to the login and one to the contact, and say /login and /contact, just like this. It should work now. If I go over here and I submit a login, so I'm going to say PedroTech, submit it, and go to the home page. Now it's displaying the data over here, although we're not passing props, which means the useSelector is working. Now, if I want to add the logout functionality, it's pretty simple as well. I'll just come to the login component. I'll come to the logout button, and as you might expect, all I have to do is I just have to dispatch the logout function, and we don't even need to pass any payload, because if you look at the store, it doesn't require any actions, which means it doesn't require any payload. It just resets the state. And if I save this, come over here, write a new name, submit it, and try to log out, it doesn't work again. Let me just debug this and see what happened. Okay, I immediately recognize the error, and I'm gonna leave this in so that you also know how to debug and see that I don't do everything perfectly the first time. So when you're altering the value of a state, you have to alter the value. So what I said before of just altering the state directly like this doesn't work, because with Redux Toolkit, you need to mutate the state value. That's why we're not returning anything. We're just mutating it. So if we want to change the value of the state to be the initial state, instead of setting the state to be equal to the initial state, what we can do is just take the state.value and set it equal to the initial state.value. And this will work the same way. So I'm gonna come over here, set my username to PedroTech, click again, and it will log out, just like you see it over here. I can then set it again, and it will have access to it over here as well. That's the very basics of Redux Toolkit. I do have a more in-depth tutorial on this. I have a video on how to make a CRUD, a full-on CRUD using Redux Toolkit. If you're interested, check that one out. It's really cool. So in this part of this video, I'm going to start integrating TypeScript. So if you're not watching this while using TypeScript, you don't have to watch this part. But if you're following the course and you want to learn how to transform this whole app and add all of the TypeScript functionalities to it, stick around, because I'm going to do that right now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start by adding simple type definitions for smaller stuff not related to Redux. So the first thing would be adding the type definition for our state over here. Very simple. This is a string. So all we do is we just add the type string over here to our use state just to enforce the fact that this has to be a string. Also, when we have an input like this and we want to have an on change, we can simply not add the type for the event. So if you want to add the type for this event, all you have to do is you just have to add a type which comes from React. So it's from the React library, which we imported over here. And we say that the type is a change event because this is on the on change, right? And we specify over here that this is from an HTML input element. So input element, just like this. Now, I know it looks weird in the beginning and it seems like it's hard to memorize, but as you type this more and as you add more inputs, you will memorize this because you do this a lot. So we just added both types. And I think this is basically it for the types not related to Redux. Now let's start adding TypeScript to Redux. So the first thing I like to do is I like to come to my store over here. And whenever I create a slice, I want to specify the format of our initial state, right? So our initial state will obviously contain what is known as the value, right? So we're going to come over here and we're going to define an interface. And this interface can be called whatever we want. I'm going to call it user state. And this state will contain one property, which is value, just like this. And value will be of type, which is an object containing a username. So we also have to create the interface for that object. So we're going to call that interface user state value, right? This is not standard. The names I'm giving here is just what I like to call it, but you can call it whatever you want. But we know that the user state value will be an object containing one key called username. So we're going to define that by saying username is of type string. And now we can just set the value to be equal to user state value. And we have our user state representing this, the initial, or not the initial state, but this state as a whole for this slice. So when we define our type over here, as our initial state, we can set this as a user state type, just like this. And when we say as, we're just enforcing that this type has to be of this type. So if we were to define our initial state without a value or with a value written wrong, it would give us a wrong answer because we're saying that this has to be a user state. So as you can see, it's just enforcing the definition that we created. Then we can come down here to our reducer functions, and there's two things that we have to account for. First of all, this function has two arguments. One is the state and one is the action. Now, the state, it depends completely on how we defined our state, right? It isn't Redux who defines how this looks like, it is us. And we defined it to have a type user state. So when we put this, now it becomes way easier to modify our user state because it has autocomplete, as you can see over here. I can say state.value, and if I even put another dot, it will give us an autocomplete for username because it knows it has to have a username because that's how we defined the type. So I'm going to delete this because let's just keep it the way it was. And we can just define the other one as a user state as well. Now, what about action? Well, action is something that comes from Redux, and it has a specific type defined by Redux. So the type is known as a payload action, just like this. Now, the payload action, again, depends on, we need to put over here what type is being modified when we have this action. So would we put here user state? Well, no, because first of all, you see this gives us an error. It is because this is not what we're passing when we call the login function. If we go over here, what we're passing is just an object containing the username. And this over here is not the user state because the user state contains the value. This is actually just the user state value. So we specify that the payload action will have a user state value, and you can see it works perfectly. Now, I believe this is basically it for all the type definitions that we needed to include. So whenever you want to create a new slice for your app, I would say follow this structure over here and just add it to your configure store so that you can have it accessible everywhere else. I just added some small type definitions as well for the state that we created and for the input, the onChange input over here. So yeah, that's basically it. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting 3 times a week and I would massively appreciate it. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, just leave them down below and I'll be open to answer everything. And yeah, that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed it and I see you guys next time.